Hello. Oh, sorry, Doug, you were on mute. How is everything going? I think my internet is more smooth now.
Okay. Hi, Isabel. And you were going to introduce, oh, there's Dan. Great. Uh, you were going to introduce for Okta?
Yes, yep. Okay. So let's get started. Sorry for the rocky internet connection there at first. Looks like I got it fixed though. So welcome everybody to another presentation by the Southern Trails chapter. Today we're going to have Father Greg speak with us, and Doug will give a more full introduction of Father Greg here in a second. I'm just here to remind everyone to keep yourselves on mute in the full group unless you want to chime in. And we just get to practice muting and unmuting skillfully and know that we won't always get it right. I'd also just like to point out the chat function. You can use this if you think of any questions during Father Greg's talk. You can just put them right into the chat. And then at the end of the meeting, at the end of Father Greg's talk, we'll get to those questions. So just to get us a little practiced with the chat, you should see a chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you might have to click on the more button and then the chat will be there. So if everyone can just open their chats, I'm going to copy and paste a prompt into the chat. And I love asking this at the beginning of our presentations because I like to hear why people are interested in seeing each presentation we do. So let me go ahead and paste that in. So what interested you in seeing today's presentation? You can go ahead and begin typing your answer, but don't hit enter. All right, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and hit enter. And if you need to take a little more time for your response, no worries, you can take that time. Okay, that's interesting, Dan. Wanting to know more about the Chinese connection to this area after discovering some porcelain. Yeah, always interested in learning something new. Yeah, these are great responses. Go ahead and finish those responses up if you still haven't. And then I just want to thank everyone for coming. The Southern Trails chapter is dedicated to studying and preserving a network of early migration trade routes that led through the southwestern states to California. I'm going to put a little bit of information in the chat for everybody. If you want to check out the Southern Trails chapter's website, you'll see that in the chat. And if you're not a member and you're interested in joining, you'll see a little information on that in the chat. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it to Doug to introduce Father Greg.
Okay, and we are doing this figure on the third Thursday of every month. We want to get the Southern Trails chapter together, stretching from Arkansas to California. This is something we can all share. And with that, I'll introduce Father Greg Adolf, who is the parish priest at St. Andrews in Sierra Vista. He's also the pastor at Tombstone, the town too tough to die, and at Bisbee, the town too high to care, or as he says, the world's largest open-air asylum. Yeah, we also need to mention that he is the president of the Southwest Mission Research Center. I've known Father Greg for a few years now. He is one of those historians that seriously impresses me with his incredible knowledge. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Father Greg.
Thank you very, very much, Doug. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this inaugural presentation via Zoom of monthly meetings. This is very exciting for me. Thank you for joining me this evening in a conversation about the Manila Galleon trade that I think will resonate with your own studies and research and interest in trails and development of trade into California. Let's just go with, if we can, Isabel, with the slides and put the slides that we've put together for you. When the Spanish governor of the Philippines, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, dispatched a galleon across the Pacific, and you go ahead to the first, from Manila to Acapulco. In 1571, he began one of the world's most ambitious and long-running commercial ventures. For 250 years, this exchange in Asian commodities and luxury goods and Spanish American silver and European products, these galleons sailed both directions, east and west, with few exceptions, from 1571 until 1815, creating for the first time the sense of the Pacific as a unity. The Pacific Ocean, the Earth's largest geographical feature, was regularly and methodically transversed, and the concepts of global economy and Pacific Rim are not new. These were developed in large part because of the Manila Galleon trade. You go to this next slide. The second, the galleon route was in its time the most significant pathway for commerce and cultural exchange between Europe and Asia by way of the Americas. It's always helpful to recall that the European voyages of discovery had their primary goal, trade with the Orient, with the Far East. And if you turn to the next slide, the discovery of the Americas, although that's garnered the lion's share of attention, was really an unexpected interruption in the quest for sea routes to Asia and those markets. The Portuguese were already established in Asia, having come from the Atlantic through the Indian Ocean and into the Western Pacific. They had established direct trade with China, but with the Spanish arrival in the New World and also the preferred means of exchange, silver, from the rich mines in Mexico and South America, the galleon trade realized the dreams of centuries of European contact and commerce. From the time of their establishment on the American mainland, the Spanish wasted no time in pursuing maritime activity in the Pacific. Balboa claimed the entire ocean for the Kingdom of Castile in 1513. Next slide. And Ferdinand Magellan, the expedition crossed the Pacific and reached the Philippines in 1521. Cortez established a shipyard at Natividad. Next slide. On Mexico's west coast, and sent an expedition, an attempted expedition in 1523. So again, America was really seen as a jumping off point for continuing exploration for trade routes to Asia. The biggest problem with establishing a viable outpost in the Far East was finding a reliable return route across the Pacific. Prevailing winds and currents prevented the return of 3 of the expeditions in the 1520s and 40s. Next slide. Finally, in 1564, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi was given the order to found a permanent settlement in the Philippines, and he did so initially in Cebu. Of course, the Philippines are named in honor of Philip II of Spain. De Legazpi dispatched, if you'll go to the next slide, the Basque pilot Andres de Urdaneta to Mexico in 1564. Urdaneta sailed far into the North Pacific above the latitude of Japan and was able to catch fresh westerlies and the eastward Kuroshio current. When they reached the North Pacific current, they were carried across to Oregon, California, then coasting down the California coast past the Baja reaching Acapulco and establishing that port as the terminus of the trade route. When the first colony in Cebu faltered in 1571, Lopez de Legazpi captured the trading center of Manila. If you go to the next slide, it's one of the world's most superb natural harbors, and significantly, Manila faces Asia, but is accessible to the Pacific through the San Bernardino Strait. It was then made the seat of government and commerce. Lopez de Legazpi sent local products to America first: cinnamon, beeswax, and the famous hemp, Manila cordage, Manila rope, so necessary for shipping. But in 1572, the colony dispatched Chinese silk and other luxury goods from the Asian mainland, which had been obtained from the Portuguese, who had permitted a trading outpost at Macau, or from the Chinese themselves, who had been trading with the Philippines for centuries and who lived in and around Manila in significant numbers. Go to the next. In this way, the great trans-Pacific trade began with Manila as the center of a commercial web that drew products from as far away as the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. The most important trade came from the Chinese mainland. And for that reason, the Spanish called the Manila Galleon the Nao de la China, the China ship. If you go to the next. The luxury commodities that loaded down the galleons were a constant source of wonder. A Spanish official, Antonio Morga, breathlessly described a cargo in 1609. Raw silk in great bundles, quantities of velvets, woven stuffs and brocades, quantities of gold and silver thread, damask, satins, taffetas, musk, ivory, precious stones of all colors, pepper, and other spices and rarities, which did I try to list them all, I would never finish. And then going to an earlier comment in the chat room, next slide, the exquisite Ming and Qing dynasty porcelain wares. If you'll go, yes, with the rich, deep colors and imaginative designs and quality glazes were among the most sought after and, of course, the most durable of the luxury goods. In fact, European artisans were not to unlock the secret of making porcelain of this quality until the 18th century. And these shards of porcelain that have been found in almost every Spanish colonial site, again, are testimony to this great trade that went on in these luxury goods. Go to the next slide, please. So Manila became the link in an economic chain that spanned much of the globe. It was the intersector of a ship bridge across which there were exchanged ideas and treasures of three worlds. Through the galleons, Spain fulfilled the dream of Marco Polo and Christopher Columbus to reach, tap, and exploit the riches of Asia. Go to the next. Like the trade itself, the ships built for the Pacific voyage at the Cavite shipyards in Manila Bay were a synthesis of European and Oriental design. They were actually designed in Spain, but the ships were built out of very durable tropical hardwoods, typically teak and mahogany. Anchor lines and rigging were of Manila hemp. Sails were sewn from durable Philippine cotton canvas. The iron fittings were forged from iron from China or Japan. If you go to the next. The galleons carried large quantities of Spanish botijas, the terracotta storage jars, together with large ceramic supply jars made in Asia. The galleons themselves, if you go to the next, were the best example of shipbuilding for 2 centuries. They were the seagoing equivalent of a jumbo jet in terms of the available maritime technology. Actually, many Filipino and Chinese crewmen remained in the Americas and brought their shipbuilding and other skills to the western frontier of New Spain. If you go to the next, please. That long voyage across the Pacific, 9,000 miles on each leg, inspired awe and dread. Westbound, the journey was very bearable, even pleasant. We were 3 months along the prevailing trade winds near the 13th parallel. Galleons departed Acapulco in late winter, arriving in Manila in the spring, usually without incident. Go ahead. Next slide. The eastbound run was a very different matter. This leg of the galleon route took approximately 6 months, sometimes longer, an extraordinarily long time to be at sea, and was often beset with tropical typhoons in the Philippine Sea and as far north as Japan, and then very fierce gales in the North Pacific above the 35th parallel, or even higher as they sailed. As the voyage lengthened and the stores of fresh fruits and vegetables dwindled, disease flourished. Scurvy, which the Spanish called the Dutch disease, often decimated crews and passengers alike, leaving sailors sometimes too weak to properly handle the heavy sails and rigging, which accounted for some of the shipwrecks. Disease and hunger took a terrible toll if the voyage was lengthened beyond the available supplies. You'll go to the next. On more than 40 occasions, the ships did not arrive, either wrecked or lost at sea. 15 of the lost vessels were westbound silver galleons. The wrecks were scattered all along the route of the galleons. The next. For the Oregonians among us, great interest very lately in what has been called the Beeswax Wreck in the Nehalem River in Tillamook County, now pretty much identified as the wreck of the galleon Santo Cristo de Burgos, wrecked in 1694 with a very large cargo of beeswax, which continued through action of storm to be thrown ashore, collected by the local natives, and then traded. And we have accounts, as you know, in Lewis and Clark's journal of that beeswax being traded from the wreck of that Manila galleon. The journey was hazardous because ships in distress had no haven anywhere along their long route. You see, the Hawaiian Islands were never discovered by the Spanish. Hawaii lay south of the normal sailing track of the galleons. If you would continue, next slide. So the first landfall on the eastbound track, if you did it exactly right, was often Cape Mendocino in Northern California. And skirting that foggy rock-bound cape, the galleon pilots looked for Point Reyes, from which they steered offshore again to avoid the Farallon Islands and passing south of Monterey Bay. They traversed the Santa Barbara Channel and the Channel Islands, sailed south along Baja to Cape, we call it's Cape Corrientes, we call it Cabo San Lucas, and then on south to into Acapulco. If you go to the next. Now, most of that coastline was unsettled, and the compulsion to explore and settle California was driven very much by the need to secure safe ports for revictualling the galleons after their long trans-Pacific crossing, and the missionary desire to reach and evangelize the native peoples. If you go to the next, our own local Jesuit explorer, Padre Eusebio Francisco Chino, and other Spanish pioneers in the Baja Northwest New Spain have frequent references to the China ships and the need to establish overland routes to California in order to establish presidios and relieving ports for those ships along the California coast. Huge part of that drive to explore and settle. Padre Chino often refers to this important economic reality when he writes to justify the expense of exploration and settlement to the officials in Mexico City. It can be truly said that the exploration and settlement of California was as important to the Philippines as it was to Mexico and to Spain. The next, please. Like Manila, Acapulco is located on a very fine harbor, deep and extensive enough to shelter a fleet. Since the hinterland was somewhat barren, the town owed its life completely to the galleon trade. If you continue. The next slide. It came alive to receive, outfit, and dispatch the galleons, and to act as a stage for the galleon fair. If you go to the next. It was a way station for the transshipment of goods and monies traded there. From Acapulco, Peruvian ships left for South America with cargo. In Lima and Quito, natives, mestizos, and Europeans alike wore cotton from the Philippines and India and silk from China. If you'll go to the next. By the mid-17th century, Oriental goods and fashions had reached most of Spanish America through the Manila Galleons. Goods destined for Mexico City and Europe were loaded on mule trains for the arduous route through the Sierra Madre, which was called the China Road. And then across the mountains at the fair in Jalapa, if you'll go to the next, merchants and trade representatives from Sevilla and Cadiz traded European goods, wine, books, iron tools, Spanish, Italian, English cloth, for the Oriental wares and for the gold, silver, indigo, and cochinelle of Mexico. These were again packed for shipment at Veracruz on the galleons then bound for Spain. As these Oriental wares began reaching the West in quantity, it increasingly influenced Spanish American and European styles. If you go to the next. The sequined Chino Poblano style, now identified as the native dress of the Republic of Mexico, was an adaptation of the richly embroidered and sequined Chinese ceremonial dress. Again, the next one. At the journey's end, the discarded colored papers in which the porcelain dishes were wrapped were transformed into paper flowers for the altars and homes and became a continuing folk art of Spanish colonial America. The next. Our typical Mexican luminarias, or farolitos, with which we decorate our homes and churches and patios at Christmas, are really a Filipino, Spanish, Mexicano adaptation of the Chinese paper lanterns, which for centuries the Chinese had used for festive lighting. The next, please. The use of fireworks to mark special events and fiestas was also an import from China through the port of Acapulco. And again, as we said, archaeological, if you go to the next, digs in the most remote areas of the Spanish New World Empire, including the Presidio at Santa Cruz de Terrenate, referred to earlier, reveal shards of ceramics that began in the Chinese porcelain works and then were transshipped to Manila and then loaded for transshipment across. These beautiful porcelains are one of the ways we both date and track Manila Galleon wrecks and tracks, as well as the spread of trade. Contemporary historian writing at present, Linda Tigas, has done a wonderful study called New Mexico Merchants, the Manila Galleons, and the Atlantic Trade, Prestige Goods in New Mexico from 1712 to 1765 in a book published in 2019. And reading that inventory from the merchants in northern New Mexico, Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and realizing the extent of that trade and influence into the fairly remote areas of the Spanish colonies. If you go to the next. What did Spanish America provide? Go to the next slide. Asia's insatiable demand for silver. And the Spanish real became the first worldwide monetary system, minted in the Americas from silver mined under absolutely appalling conditions. These beautifully minted coins were accepted everywhere. You know, well into the 20th century, the Mexican silver dollar, the silver peso, was the preferred currency of the China trade. When small change was scarce, ocho real coins, pieces of 8, could be cut into 8 bits. And because these Spanish coins, Mexican silver, were legal tender in the United States into the 1800s, Americans still occasionally refer to a quarter as 2 bits. The viability of the trade and the splendor of Manila peaked between 1610 and 1640. During this time, silver was plentiful, suppliers of luxury goods were active, construction in Manila and the Cavite shipyards was booming, and there were very few competitors. Now, a number of factors diminished the success of the trade and the colony, which depended entirely on the Manila galleon trade. The next slide, please. Dutch and English pirates certainly proved damaging. And the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 created chaotic conditions in China that were unfavorable for trade. And the opening of Canton to other Western powers in 1685 also was debilitating. If you'll go to the next. The closing of Japan in hostility directed toward the Christianity being brought in by the Spanish, and the closing of Japan to Western trade, specifically Spanish trade, also proved very damaging, as the Japan-Philippines trade had been very lively before that time. The incursion of Northern Europeans into the Caribbean also created new challenges and expenses on the other side of Mexico, and decreasing silver production after 1620 was detrimental to the Spanish imperial economy as a whole. If you go to the next slide. In Europe, the wars of succession and the dynastic wars of the 18th century devoured resources and diverted funds needed for colonial infrastructure and protection of trade. And merchants in Sevilla lobbied for the curtailment of the trade, and the desire to limit the export of silver from the empire into Asia also played a part. And so we find Filipino governors begging repeatedly for higher trade allowance, begging for more soldiers, more settlers, begging for additional financial resources, soldiers, and next slide, permission to trade directly with Portuguese Macau. You go to the next slide. The restrictions imposed by Madrid helped to foster smuggling of legendary proportions aboard these already richly laden galleons. The lengths to which the galleon owners and investors went to hide contraband goods and to remove goods from notice and taxation were astounding. And finally, the King of Spain settled for a lump sum every year rather than trying to figure out how to catch these tax evaders and get a realistic proportion of that tax. If you go again, please. A very rare inspection occurred in Acapulco in 1637 and revealed 10 times the permitted amount of cargo being shipped. So the royal instructions were scrupulously observed, but they were never enforced. Again, the galleon trade continued until 1815, linking Madrid with its most distant colony. Continue, please. It continued to bring silks, porcelain, particularly religious artwork, vestments, tortoiseshell combs, embroidered silk shawls, the mantones de Manila, as we call them, that had become characteristic dress for women in Spain and her American colonies. If you go again. Ultimately, Spaniards in Manila, Mexico, and Spain quarreled over profits. Other nations entered the China trade. Napoleon's invasion of Spain left her in confusion, and the War of Independence in Mexico broke the chain in 1815. But for almost 250 years, these galleons carried their treasures across the Pacific. They pioneered the trans-Pacific trade in the longest and most enduring trade route during the age of sail. At its peak, the Manila-Acapulco route of the galleons was one of the great commercial and its achievements. It was a logistical achievement, unlike any other of that time. Its long-term effects continue to shape the contours and the cultures of many nations which line the Pacific Rim. And those interested in Spanish colonial history are becoming more and more aware of the impact of the galleon trade and its importance for exploration of the West, Southwest, and the establishment of important presidios such as Santa Barbara, San Diego, and the influx of not just goods, but new ideas and cultural impact that have really shaped the area since. So that's kind of, if you will, a very quick overview of the galleon, the Manila Galleon trade. And I thought if we have time, we can share some Q&A and get into this more. Your comments would be wonderful.
Thank you, Father Greg. If anybody has any questions that you didn't put in the chat, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask them directly now.
Dan, I'm sure you have some.
Well, fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed that. I always like it when you can get overview information to give the big perspective on things, and that's what I think this represents. It's very, very fascinating to me. It was about 1999 or 2000 that I went with Don Garate, the historian from Tumacacori, and we explored for and ultimately that day found the original Terrenate Presidio. And then subsequently took a group of archaeologists from Tucson down there, and they're the ones that pointed out the Chinese porcelain to me. And I tried to send a picture. I don't know if that worked in the chat function. I sent one to you by email just a moment ago, Doug, if you could figure out how to share it, that shows the Chinese porcelain next to the imitation from Mexico City, which is the Spanish mayolica, which is about 3 times thicker than the very delicate Chinese porcelain. So that maybe you can share that. I don't know. I'm not the technical expert, but thank you, Father Greg. I really appreciate you presenting this. Maybe you can write an article for our Desert Tracks magazine journal on this same topic to reach the rest of our members that aren't with us tonight.
Thank you.
There it is. Yeah.
There it is. Wonderful.
The round object at the bottom of the photograph, on the other side of it, you can see the soldered on piece where is the back of the button that's sewed onto a Spanish military uniform. That's a copper button.
Hmm.
And then in the lower right is the Spanish mayolica, which is an imitation of the Chinese. And then the thin piece that's darker blue right in the middle is Chinese, as well as the one just to the upper left from it that's got white, that one right there. Yeah. And then some Indian pottery there. The whole site is untouched, never been excavated. And it has a melted adobe ruins on it. And for the Southern Trails members, it's directly on top of the Southern Trail that the 49ers came to the Santa Cruz Valley in, and subsequently to Tucson. Several of the 49er diaries mention running into some old ruins there. It's 40 miles from where you're at there in Sierra Vista, Father Greg.
Oh, yes.
I
Yeah.
really enjoyed your pictures too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the presence of the Chinese porcelain and of course the imitation is a very valuable archaeological tool on all of these digs. We really are able to establish, again, trade routes, exchange of goods, and somewhat able to date when this was traded with some obvious limitations. But it's the durability of the porcelain has been a real archaeological.
Yeah, it is. And they found it at Tumacacori, Tubac, Tucson, and other places around the area too. I think probably also at the second Terrenate site near Tombstone,
Right.
which was also called Santa Cruz de Terrenate. Cool.
I think Mark had his hand raised. Mark, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, very interesting speech. Could you go back to the slides you were talking about the pesos and how they were cut up? You're saying 2 bits, but you said they were cut up in 8 pieces.
Right.
Pieces of 8.
Pieces
That's
of 8.
kind of, yeah, that's kind of sparked my idea on that.
Yeah, that's the famous pieces of eight, of pirate lore, and there it is. Yeah, and again, that's the Mexican peso. These pieces of eight remained very much the standard, especially for Southeast Asian and South China trade, well into the 1920s. Long-standing reliance upon that currency.
Father Greg, this is Dan again. Is that where we get the 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar phrase?
Yes, that's
Cool. I didn't know. It just popped into my head right now.
That's what I asked the question because I found that interesting, like pieces of eight, and did not realize what that was. And then people say, oh, 2 bits, you think a quarter, but oh yeah, okay, a quarter, 2 bits, 4 pieces.
Mhm.
Okay. Also on the pottery, because I'm an archaeologist, and I've probably found some of this pottery is Chinese, not knowing some of the areas where it probably came from. I mean, recently down in Southwest Texas and Falcon a couple of years ago, we found what we thought was just normal pottery from people down that area because it's mostly Hispanic, Mexican. And one of the archaeologists from TAC with this, who did his dissertation on Spanish colonial, said, no, that's Spanish colonial glassware and jugware. And so it actually was interesting because that was part of the De La Tejas trail coming from Mexico City down along there. But it's a new area we think that it was. I never got a chance to do the site for them, but I'll still would probably work on some of that stuff. No, I've now worked on the Pike San Isabel Comanche Cimarron Grasslands National Forest area, but I'll still continue to look at some of the Spanish colonial stuff. And I just thought it was really, really interesting on some of that because a lot of us will misidentify stuff thinking it's not, but it's probably something completely different.
Well, there's been a lot of really interesting research done lately on Chinese porcelain and the manufacture and the sites in China, and China itself has taken a great interest in the monopoly that was centered in just 2 cities in South China. And a great deal of research being done on that that's absolutely fascinating, not only on the production and control of what was understood to be a luxury item, but also the research being done now on the exchange of goods between Japan and the Philippines, and the Spanish influence into Japan through those trade goods is really sort of opening up at this point again, I think that when we talk about the Pacific Rim and think that's a new concept, we're discovering the Pacific Rim and that whole concept of transnational and international trade was already established in the 17th century, well established.
Right. And I was wondering, was any of this found near the Coronado National Forest or on the BLM land down that area?
I'm not certain whether there's been any
Mark, the site that I was talking about is less than 10 miles from Coronado National Forest.
Okay. The
It's
reason
in Mexico, but it's right. You know where the Coronado National Monument is on the border?
Right.
It's about 10 miles southwest of there.
Oh, the reason is years ago when I was in the Tonto National Forest, we were able to acquire what's called a XRF, and this was a PXRF. And what it does is it looks like a ray gun. You can shoot it at, you put it on the stuff you're looking at, and it gives you parts per million of what you're looking at. So actually you can identify what the temper and the paint and the other material you're looking at. That's why in the Forest Service down there, we were to acquire one. One is in the Tonto and one is over in Albuquerque. But if it was on the forest, they could request that to look at some of the stuff that you have there. That's why it's just got me interested in that because of the pottery, the trade routes, and how we can look at how people were trading.
Did we have any other questions for Father Greg?
It
Yes,
looks like Carlos has got something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is Carlos Fiscara in Phoenix. Father Greg, very interesting presentation. I appreciate that. I read books on Captain Cook and the measures he took to cure scurvy and other seaborne diseases. With the issues that the Spanish had with the galleons returning to the east, did the Spanish ever attempt to cure the issues that occurred after months at sea?
Well, they certainly understood that the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables had something to do with scurvy. They had made that connection. But mostly, Spanish sources attributed the symptoms of scurvy to bad water. It wasn't until Captain Cook's doctor basically figured out the connection between vitamin C and those fruits that are heavy with vitamin C, and hence the designation of British sailors as limeys, because they were being doctored with fresh lime or lemon juice in order to stave off the effects of scurvy. But that was, that wasn't until Captain Cook's exploration of the Hawaiian Islands and at that period that connection was made.
Father Greg, Dan again, do you know if did you run across any documentation in your studies about the Manila-Mexico trade that referred to any Chinese people coming on the ships to Mexico in those early years?
Well, here again with this study of genetics that's now popularized, and you can give it as a gift to figure out what your DNA is. We're really making a lot of discoveries about how many Filipino and Chinese and Asians were entering and living and settling and marrying in this area, and that we were kind of a cultural mix a long time before the Chinese were brought from China to work on the Central Pacific Railroad. That was already significant Chinese population here, mixed. And I think that going forward, we're going to see a lot more of that we're much more of a cultural mix than anyone had guessed. Certainly the Chinese shipbuilders and Filipino shipbuilders were highly prized technicians and artisans whose services were purchased, and they became the bosses of the shipyards here in the New World on the west coast of Mexico and later California, that those skills were highly prized.
Well, that's really interesting. The reason I asked the question is because Don Garate also took me to Arispe once, and just north of Arispe, we went on a little field trip out to some local caves that the locals go to a lot for picnics. And there, along with the Indian pictographs on the caves, is a whole bunch of apparent Chinese characters on the wall. And I found that really fascinating. I don't know more about it than the fact that I stood there and looked at it, and it was really interesting.
Yeah, the Chinese were very present in northern Sonora during the 19th century in particular, and coming in to work on railroads, the mines, etc. And it's a very troubled history, because much of there was a great deal of targeting of the Chinese population in northern Sonora and southern Arizona, particularly by Pancho Villa and other revolutionaries who saw them as intruders and exploiters of the local Mexican populations, because they were the storekeepers. They were the storekeepers, merchants, and very troubled history. The Chinese community in Tucson was not at all happy with the erection of this equestrian statue of Pancho Villa in downtown Tucson. That was there was living memory of that racism and their immediate ancestors being targeted.
Is it fair to say, Father, that one of the reasons that it became urgent to push across the desert to California to make contact with the missions that way was to shorten some of that route for the Manila Galleon?
Oh, absolutely. That is the currents and the seasonal winds along the California coast made the resupplying of the missions and the presidios very, very sketchy. You'll remember that the settlement in San Diego nearly failed. I think they were getting ready to try to return overland when that supply ship, long overdue, finally turned up in San Diego Bay and basically saved the colony. And so to find an overland route was certainly the dream of Chino, Padre Chino, and Father Garces, Padre Font, who came with the went with the Anza expedition. In all of those accounts, we find frequent references to the China ship and the importance. And again, as I said, this is justifying the expense of the expedition based on we can find a way to havens in these ports more secure for that Pacific trade, and therefore it's worth spending the money to mount this huge expedition across the desert to see if we can find a shorter way from either Santa Fe and the Spanish colonies in northern New Mexico across to California, or from northern Sonora, present-day Arizona, to try to shorten and establish land routes to move cattle and goods over to those missions and presidios and the presidios. As I said earlier, the exploration of California and the settling of California was as important to the Philippines as it was to Spain and to the officials in Mexico City.
I know that there is someone here who won't speak up to ask a question unless we ask him to. David Miller, I know you must have a question.
Oh, I thought it was an excellent presentation. I think all of my questions have been answered. I don't know nearly as much about this subject as you and many of the other people here do, but it was very, very well done, and I really appreciate it.
Well, Father Greg, I want to thank you very much for helping us with this inaugural presentation. We have started off on a seriously high note. I note
Looks
that.
like we have a hand raised from Jay.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to unmute you, Jay, or ask you to unmute yourself there. That might have been applause also, now that I'm thinking about it.
I don't know, that looks like a photograph rather than live.
Yeah.
Than live.
If
You
I
don't see a
might,
photograph applauding very often. Jay
Donna
Lawrence.
Isabella,
Go ahead, John.
yeah, if I might, I found that fascinating. It's not a subject I know anything about, which is why I logged in. I found it very interesting. It's a very good presentation. And you'll detect from the accent that I have some limey in me. In fact, raised in North Yorkshire, which is where Captain Cook was from, of course. But the pieces of 8 on the limeys kind of leads me to the question of, did any of these trade routes have problems with piracy at all, or was that all focused on the Atlantic Ocean?
No, the piracy was also in the Pacific. There was a Dutch expedition to capture Manila at one point that failed and basically ended in the massacre of the Dutch sailors. There were also, as you know, Francis Drake, El Drake, the dragon, raided the west coast of Spanish America, the California coast. The simply referred to as Dutch pirates or English pirates, but it was, as you know, those were letters of marque. They were privateers sailing on behalf of the government, and but far enough away from home that acts of piracy become conveniently deniable. Again, the accounts of Dutch pirates on the west coast of Mexico, Peru, Chile, California, Alta California, that was certainly a threat, not the same as in the Caribbean or the Atlantic, but it was there because the west coast was so poorly defended. There were forts, presidios at major ports, but really no strong naval presence that could go out and meet the challenge. You had to wait until the pirates tried to come ashore or get into the harbor that you're protecting. So it was, yeah, it was very definitely a part of the story.
And so did ship design and the routes that they took have to take that into account? Did they modify the way that they behaved?
The galleons were all armed, and the problem was that they were basically merchant ships that were armed and did not have the crew capable of fighting the guns in most instances. So it was when Lord Anson made his circumnavigation of the globe and intercepted the Manila Galleon in 1742. The fight, I think, lasted 11 minutes, and the battle, and something like 11 million silver pesos were taken, and an enormous amount of bullion. So it was a very attractive target.
Good, thank you, thank you.
Well, I'll just encourage everyone, if you'd like more, you can always go check out Octa's YouTube channel, and there are lots of great videos on there about the trails.
And watch for announcements of our next on the third Thursday of August. Yeah, I got that right. We'll put out an announcement to you. And Father Greg, again, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Mark's got his hand up.
Oh, I think that is actually applause.
That's just a clap.
Well, that's applause. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. And thank you, Isabel.
Of course. I'm glad it started rocky, but it went smooth. So
It did. Very much thanks to you. And we still have no idea what was wrong with his.
yeah, maybe it is a privacy setting. It makes me want to look into it more. So.
Well, I think part of the problem was he didn't know how to start PowerPoint.
Yeah, I was like, okay, well, at that point, then I'll just do the slides. No worries.
I shouldn't give this away, but the only time I've ever seen him give a presentation that wasn't first rate was when someone had him talking about computers. I don't know how he got talked into it. But
that's interesting. Yeah, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses.
Okay.
All
Take
right.
care. Thanks again.
Yep, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.